Is Ukraine actually winning the war? In the US we don't hear about it anymore. At all. There is no real possibility of winning, unless it means an internal event in Russia causing a collapse of the regime there. Most likely now is a frozen conflict. To win on the battlefield, Ukraine would someone to carpet bomb the Russian front lines, and for them to have enough armor, artillery and available troops to drive through and maneuver in the Russian rear. The West passed up the chance of winning on the ground in spring last year. This is now a war of attrition. I would say Ukraine was making gains, but they were nowhere near winning the war. The only way Ukraine can win the war is to maintain the attrition, and Russia just gets fed up and goes home like they did in Afghanistan. But one thing is for sure. Ukraine can't even hold their ground without American assistance. If Trump wins, that will be the end of it. The Russians will definitely hold out until the American election. No, Ukraine is not winning the war. Ukraine is actually going to lose the war unless the US and Europe provide it with more weapons and ammunition. Russia isn't advancing because they're waiting for the US and Europe to stop funding Ukraine. Not because of the loss of troops. They have plenty of troops. Huge amount of ignorance of the current situation on here. It is absolutely not a stalemate at the moment. Russia is currently undertaking a huge offensive, probably the largest of the war by either side in terms of manpower and equipment. It is primarily focused around Avdiivka, but in recent days it has heated up across the entire Eastern Front. Particularly worrying is the situation around Kupiansk and Bakhmut, both of which are under extreme pressure at the moment. There are reports in the last few days of Ukrainians running out of ammunition and having to cede ground as a result. If this continues, it will become extremely difficult. It is essential that both the USA and EU get their support packages across the line. Ukraine will never win through any sort of manpower advantage. Their only hope is through Western systems, in particular artillery and air power. If the packages don't get approved, the US elections will be an irrelevance for Ukraine, as their lines will likely collapse by spring. It is very sobering to see what is happening, in particular over the last week or so. In a war, winning means achieving your goals. So what are Ukrainian goals? Easiest answer is territorial integrity and no regime change. In latter they achieved that. There is no chance of Russia installing a puppet leader. In former, the losses isn't as bad as it was feared. Russian invasion didn't turn into steamroller it was expected, feared. Russian losses are also very high. Regardless of what they actually achieved, an entire offensive seems to have ground to a near halt. So in that regard they aren't losing but aren't winning, in a sense that they either prevented loss of territory or regained significant parts of it. They are still fighting, inflicting losses, and are able to strike deep into Russia itself, which is more than most people expected. If Ukrainian goal was survive, then they've won there. If goal was prevent Russia from doing anything, they haven't. So at this point stalemate seems most accurate description. Both sides can mostly hold what they have but not take more. In the end I suspect Ukraine will win. In a sense Finland won winter war. Some territorial loss, Crimea probably, and other concessions, but not as much as Russia hoped for and Ukraine feared. The war is currently in a stalemate, which is probably the closest Ukraine will ever get to winning without serious events within Russia. They're against a massive force with a lot of might. Despite the constant media talk about Russia using WW2 weapons etc., the West, however, are winning pretty well. We have large stockpiles of old equipment which was designed to fight Russia in Eastern Europe, and we have ended up in a scenario where our equipment is fighting Russia at the expense of zero Western lives. except for volunteers. Our greatest threat has been significantly weakened as a result, and nations that were neutral before are now pro-NATO. I'm in the US and I don't hear anything about it. No, they are slowly losing it, if the goal is to regain their former borders. No, stalemate at best. I am for the US sending more aid, but most of the EU still isn't even providing their 2% to NATO that they agreed to decades ago. They should be doing this even before the Russian invasion. The fact that they still aren't is sad. Europe needs to step up. The US needs to stop being their welfare daddy. It is an interesting war for sure. On one hand, you have a little military without experience, but good training and fantastic weapons. On the other hand, you got Russian, poorly trained, equipped, and led, but in bigger number. They are now pulling WW2 tactics in the last year. Russia's goal is to outlast Ukraine, making the news stagnate and ultimately out of the news feed, ultimately losing the West's interest to support it. It is a lot easier to hold a line than it is to advance. But they are pretty terrible at that, too. But Ukraine doesn't have the number to make a lot of big moves. But they are still making good progress in hurting the Russian war machine. In a conversation war, you want at least 5-1 and as much as 20-1 on a defensive position. Ukraine is doing it with less than 1-1. Heck, Russia couldn't take the place at 20-1. The big edge is Ukraine advisors and style of leadership. Ukraine got the best advisors around them. Thousands of high-ranking officers around the globe, picking small but devastating battle to fight, with a junior leadership on the ground decision-making mentally, instead of the heavy top-down. It won't be over fast and may need a Russian collapse to end or a total defeat from Ukraine. But as long as Ukraine got the West on its side, it stand a chance of surviving. No, they don't actually have much of a chance. It's a small population fighting against a far larger force. The Russians just have to hold their ground, and eventually, without outside troops, the Ukrainian government will have to come to some type of agreement. BTW. Fuck Russia. Considering Russia expected them to roll over and give up inside of a month, or probably less, I'd say they're doing a damn fine job. At the same time, I don't see Russia giving up on this offensive until Putin passes away. And even then, coin flip, the power vacuum left by Putin will destabilize Russia massively. Whoever seizes power might be worse. I would yes into fact they are surviving. But I suppose it depends on how you define winning the war. I mean, they were expected to get stomped on within weeks, and it's been 1.5 years, so I call that a win. No, there is no measure that can suggest otherwise. Simple terms as such. Russia has more people, more money, more resources. It is mostly self-sufficient and can grind this out for years. The sanctions are not having a strong effect, and their biggest concern is probably birth rates at this point. Their infrastructure is intact. They've lost no land. Nobody can get behind them to attack from the back. Compare to Ukraine. They have lost land. They have much less people and have lost millions in refuge. They've lost a lot of infrastructure. They're vulnerable to attack from multiple sides. They've amassed immense debt, effectively selling the country to the US as a vassal. Their resources for maintaining war are almost entirely dependent on aid. This will dry up. It has already started to, as the Western powers throw money at their pet project in the Middle East. Instead, it is a war of attrition. Ukraine can't win a war of attrition against Russia. I'd hazard to say only the USA and China could. If anyone can offer any other high-level thoughts as to why this is inverse and that Ukraine are actually doing better than Russia winning, then I'd like to hear those ideas. I see it that this grinds out for a few years. Russia does a job done, boys, we got let's go home, without ever really stating their goals, and that's that. Ukraine is a riddled mess beholden to the USA. Spends decades rebuilding to apply for EU and NATO. And Russia just continues to exist, becoming more insular over time. Neither state will collapse. Nobody is nuking anyone. It's not WW3. It's just another Afghanistan. No, I don't think so. But then again, Russia definitely aren't winning the war either. It seems to have settled down into a stalemate so far as I can tell. On the one very cynical hand, it's good because it keeps the churn of Russian forces going, which weakens Putin as long as it continues. But on the other much more humanitarian hand, it's awful for the poor people forced to fight. My view is that Ukraine cannot achieve its objective of forcing Russia out. Russia cannot achieve its objective of conquering Ukraine. Time for negotiations to put an end to the fighting. Seems like a stalemate ATM. No idea, but just think about how Russia has won every war it has in recent history. They basically fight a war of attrition. There's no way Ukraine can sustain losses indefinitely the way Russia can. Between that and the major supporter of Ukraine now being distracted by Palestine, I don't see it going Ukraine's way at the end of the day. My current pet theory is that whatever intelligence apparatus Russia currently has, its current incarnation of the KGB, actually encouraged or convinced Hamas to attack on October 7th just to take some heat and focus off the conflict in Ukraine. My understanding is, as of right now, the war is locked in a stalemate. Russia has suffered heavy casualties and continues to, but Ukraine hasn't made any major advancements recently. The only way to end this war is for Putin to die. He will send troops in to slaughter for as long as it takes. His hope all along is that the West and the EU would lose patience with this war and lessen or completely withdraw their support, which is already kind of happening. Putin originally thought the war would last a couple weeks, and Russia would sweep through Ukraine easily, which isn't what happened. But Russia is so massive. Putin has enough people to be patient, and he knows that. It's getting kind of scary. Really. I wish both sides could come to an agreement, which will never probably happen because it wouldn't go exactly the way they want it to. But they need to realize this is not only the future of Europe at stake, but the future of the entire world. The whole entire world could easily be dragged into this overnight, and we've been doing everything to prevent that. But as I said, patience in the West and the EU is starting to run thin, which is not good.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. TooAfraidToAsk is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.